At Christmas Eve, my father said, "Gifts for the worthy ones only," handing me nothing. I revealed the hidden stock portfolio, claiming my share and silencing the room. I, 32M, stood in the doorway of my childhood home, watching snow gather on the windowsills while my family bustled around the Christmas tree. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, but underneath it all, I could smell the familiar stench of favoritism that had poisoned this house for decades. My father sat in his leather armchair like a king on his throne, surveying his kingdom with that self-satisfied smile I'd grown to despise. My older brother lounged on the sofa, already halfway through his third glass of expensive scotch, the kind Dad kept locked away from everyone except his golden child. My younger sister perched on the ottoman, her designer handbag prominently displayed, another gift from our parents that I'd heard about through the family grapevine but had never been consulted about. Mom fluttered between the kitchen and living room, pretending everything was normal, that this wasn't the same toxic dance we'd been doing for 32 years. She asked if anyone wanted more cookies, her voice bright and brittle as glass. I'd driven 6 hours through a snowstorm to be here. My wife had begged me not to come, reminded me of last year's disaster, the year before that, the lifetime of being treated like the family's consolation prize. But something had pulled me back this time. Maybe it was the envelope sitting in my jacket pocket, heavy with knowledge that would finally balance the scales. Dad cleared his throat, the sound that always preceded his pronouncements. He announced it was time for gifts, and everyone gathered around like disciples waiting for communion. My brother straightened up, already knowing what was coming. My sister's eyes lit up with anticipation. I stayed near the doorway, arms crossed, watching the performance unfold. Dad pulled out a slim envelope first and handed it to my brother. He opened it, and even from across the room, I could see the check. $25,000. My brother's face split into a grin, and he thanked Dad profusely, going on about how this would really help with the down payment on that vacation house he'd been eyeing. My sister went next. Another envelope, another check. $15,000 for her to expand her boutique, the one that had been hemorrhaging money for 2 years while Mom and Dad kept it afloat with bailout after bailout. Then Dad's eyes swept past me entirely. He reached for a wrapped box and handed it to Mom, told her she deserved something special for putting up with all of us. She blushed and protested weakly while unwrapping a diamond bracelet that probably cost more than my car. I waited. The room had gone quiet except for the crackling fire. My brother glanced at me, smirked, then looked away. My sister was already on her phone, probably calculating how to spend her windfall. Dad leaned back in his chair and delivered the line he must have been rehearsing all week. He said this year, gifts were for the worthy ones only, for those who'd made something of themselves, who'd honored the family name and made him proud. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mom looked at the floor. My sister kept scrolling through her phone, pretending she hadn't heard the bomb Dad just dropped. My brother took another drink, that smirk never leaving his face. I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest, the same anger that had built up over 3 decades of being the forgotten son, the disappointment, the one whose achievements were never quite enough. While my brother coasted through life on Dad's connections and money, getting executive positions he hadn't earned, I'd worked 2 jobs through college. While my sister played at entrepreneurship with their funding, I'd built my career from nothing, sleeping in my car between shifts, eating ramen for months. But I'd also done something else, something they didn't know about. I asked Dad if he was sure that was how he wanted to play this Christmas. My voice came out steady, calmer than I felt. He looked at me with those cold eyes and said he was certain, asked if I had a problem with how he chose to distribute his hard-earned money. I pulled the envelope from my jacket pocket. The paper felt substantial, important. I told him we needed to talk about Grandpa's estate. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Dad's face went from smug to stony in an instant. Mom's head snapped up, and even my brother sat forward, suddenly interested. I reminded them that Grandpa had died 18 months ago. We all remembered the funeral, the reading of the will, the way Dad had summarized everything for us in that same armchair. He'd told us Grandpa had left everything to him as the eldest son, as was traditional. A few small bequests to charity, some jewelry for Mom, but the bulk of the estate, the house, the savings, the investments, all went to Dad. My sister asked what this had to do with anything, her voice irritated. I told them I'd been going through some old boxes in my garage last month, stuff from when Grandpa died that I'd stored away. I'd found a folder of documents, letters between Grandpa and his financial advisor. Being curious, I'd read through them. Dad's jaw tightened. He told me those were private matters. I continued anyway, said I'd discovered that Grandpa had established a stock portfolio back in the 80s, something completely separate from his main estate. The portfolio had been set up specifically for his grandchildren, to be divided equally among us when the youngest turned 30. My sister had turned 32 months ago. The room was dead silent now. My brother had set down his glass. My sister's phone lay forgotten in her lap. Dad started to say something, but I kept talking. I explained that this portfolio had been worth about $50,000 when Grandpa set it up. Over 40 years of compound growth and smart reinvestment, it was now worth approximately $750,000. That meant $250,000 for each of us grandchildren. Mom gasped. My sister's mouth fell open. My brother looked between me and Dad like he was watching a tennis match. Dad's face had gone red. He said I didn't know what I was talking about, that I'd misunderstood some old paperwork. I pulled out copies of the documents and held them up. I told him I'd contacted Grandpa's financial advisor, the same one mentioned in the letters, who was very much alive and very surprised to hear that we grandchildren had never been informed about the portfolio. The advisor had confirmed everything, sent me statements, transfer documents, all of it. I walked over and dropped the papers on the coffee table. I said the advisor had been wondering why Dad had never reached out to distribute the funds according to Grandpa's wishes. The trust had matured 8 months ago, right on schedule. My brother grabbed the papers and started reading. His eyes went wide. Dad stood up, his voice rising. He said this was a family matter, that I was making accusations on Christmas Eve, ruining everything with my jealousy and bitterness. I told him I wasn't bitter anymore, just informed. I said I'd consulted with an attorney who specialized in estate law. According to her, what Dad had done was called conversion, taking property that belonged to someone else and treating it as his own. In some states, it was a felony. In all states, it was grounds for a civil lawsuit. My sister found her voice and asked Dad if this was true, if Grandpa really left them money he'd never told them about. Dad sputtered, said things were complicated, that he'd managed the portfolio carefully, that he was protecting them from making rash financial decisions. I laughed, couldn't help it. I asked him how giving my brother $25,000 tonight was protecting him from rash decisions. How bailing out my sister's failing business repeatedly was good financial guardianship. Mom spoke up then, her voice small. She asked Dad if he'd known about this portfolio all along. The look on his face told us everything we needed to know. My brother stood up, the papers still in his hand. He said this was over $200,000 each. Asked Dad where the money was now. Dad tried to bluster his way through, said he'd reinvested it, that it was safe, that he'd been planning to tell us when the time was right. I told them I knew exactly where the money was because the financial advisor had sent me the complete transaction history. The portfolio had been liquidated 14 months ago, shortly after Grandpa's funeral. The funds had been transferred to an account in Dad's name. Since then, he'd used it for all sorts of things: the vacation to Europe he and Mom took last spring, the new car in the driveway, my brother's previous bailouts, my sister's boutique renovations. My sister's voice went shrill. She said he'd used their inheritance to fund their gifts, that he'd been playing Santa Claus with their own money. The truth of it settled over the room like nuclear fallout. Dad had stolen from his own grandchildren, spent their inheritance, then had the audacity to play favorites with what remained, making us beg for scraps from our own table. Mom started crying. She said she didn't know, that Dad had handled all the finances, that she'd never questioned where the money for their lifestyle upgrades had come from. I almost believed her. My brother turned on Dad, asked how he could do this, how he could steal from his own family. Dad's face cycled through emotions: anger, fear, defiance, desperation. Finally, he landed on righteous indignation. He said he'd raised us, fed us, clothed us, put roofs over our heads. He said that money was family money anyway, that Grandpa would have wanted him to use it to keep the family strong. I asked him if Grandpa would have wanted him to exclude one grandson entirely while showering the others with stolen funds. That hit home. Dad's shoulders slumped. My sister was crying now too, but angry tears. She said she'd wondered why Dad was suddenly so generous the past year, why he'd been able to fund so many things without apparent strain. She'd thought his investments had paid off. I told them my attorney had drafted paperwork. I had two options on the table. The first was to file a lawsuit, expose everything, let the courts sort out the theft and repayment with interest and penalties. That would take years and destroy what was left of this family publicly. The second option was for Dad to repay each of us our full inheritance, $250,000 plus interest calculated from when the funds should have been distributed. That came to about $280,000 each, including the growth we'd missed out on. He had 30 days to make the transfers. My brother asked what happened if Dad refused. I said then we'd go with option one, and I'd make sure everyone knew. The extended family, Dad's business partners, the country club crowd he loved so much. I'd let them all know how he'd stolen from his own grandchildren and played favorites with stolen money. Dad collapsed back into his chair. He looked old, suddenly diminished. He asked where he was supposed to get that kind of money in 30 days. I suggested he sell the vacation house, the new car, maybe downsize from this big house they didn't need anymore. I said he'd gotten very good at liquidating assets that didn't belong to him, so perhaps he could apply those skills to his own property for once. Mom wiped her eyes and said they'd figure it out, that they'd make it right. Dad just stared at the floor. My sister picked up her check, the $15,000 that was supposed to be her Christmas miracle. She tore it in half and dropped it on the coffee table. She said she wanted her real inheritance, the one Grandpa had actually left her, not scraps from Dad's table. My brother did the same with his check, though I could see it pained him more. $25,000 was real money, but it wasn't $280,000. I told them my attorney would be in touch after Christmas with the wire transfer instructions. I said I expected to see the funds in my account by January 20th, or the lawsuit would be filed on January 21st. Dad asked if I was really going to destroy the family over money. I told him I wasn't the one who destroyed it. He'd done that when he decided some of his children were worthy and others weren't, when he'd stolen from all of us and pretended it was generosity. I said I was just correcting the record. Mom asked if I'd stay for dinner. I told her no, that I had a long drive home and a wife who'd been right about not coming. I said maybe next Christmas would be different, once accounts were settled and everyone knew where they actually stood. My sister stood up and gave me a hug, whispered that she was sorry for not seeing it before, for not standing up when Dad had dismissed me year after year. My brother shook my hand, said he'd make sure Dad followed through, that this was overdue. I walked to the door and pulled on my coat. The snow was falling heavier now, already covering my car. I turned back one last time and saw Dad still sitting in his chair, staring at nothing, his kingdom crumbling around him. I told him Merry Christmas. He didn't respond. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since Christmas Eve, and my phone hasn't stopped ringing. I figured I owed everyone an update since this situation has evolved in ways I didn't fully anticipate. The day after Christmas, my sister called me. She'd done some digging of her own and found more irregularities in how Dad had been handling family finances. Turned out the boutique bailouts I'd mentioned weren't just generosity. Dad had been telling her the money was loans that she'd need to repay, all while using our inheritance to fund them. She'd been drowning in guilt over owing him tens of thousands when it was her own money all along. My brother called 2 days later. He'd gone through his own records and realized every major gift he'd received in the past 18 months had come right after Grandpa died. The down payment help for his condo, the investment in his friend's startup that went belly up, even the expensive engagement ring he'd bought his girlfriend, all funded by Dad at convenient moments when my brother needed help. Dad had been playing the generous father while spending the inheritance that would have made all of us financially independent. But the real revelation came from Mom. She showed up at my house unannounced on New Year's Day. My wife let her in, and we sat in the kitchen while Mom told me everything. She'd confronted Dad properly after I left Christmas Eve, demanded to see all the financial records. What she found shocked even her. Dad hadn't just taken our inheritance. He'd been systematically draining other family assets for years, living far beyond his actual means. His business was failing, had been failing for the better part of 5 years. Instead of admitting it, he'd been propping up his lifestyle with Grandpa's estate, our inheritance, and even Mom's personal savings that she'd inherited from her own mother. Mom cried while telling me this. She said she'd trusted him completely, never questioned anything because he'd always been the financial mind in the relationship. She'd signed documents without reading them, assuming he had their best interests at heart. Now she was looking at a marriage built on lies and a retirement that might not exist. She asked if my 30-day deadline was firm. I told her it was, but that the lawsuit would be against Dad specifically, not her. She'd been as much a victim as the rest of us. She nodded and said she'd already contacted a divorce attorney. That stunned me. My parents had been married for 38 years. Mom said she couldn't stay with someone who'd not only stolen from their children, but had also gambled away her security. She said the man she'd married would never have done this, which meant she didn't actually know who she'd been married to all these years. She left after an hour, looking more determined than I'd ever seen her. The next call came from Dad's brother, my uncle. Word had spread through the family about what happened. Uncle asked if the rumors were true, if Dad had really stolen our inheritance. I confirmed it and sent him copies of the documents. Uncle went silent for a long moment, then told me something I hadn't known. Grandpa had apparently set up similar portfolios for his other grandchildren, my uncle's 3 kids. Uncle had distributed those funds years ago when his youngest turned 30, exactly as Grandpa had specified. He'd assumed Dad had done the same. Now Uncle was furious, saying Dad had made him look like a fool, that the whole family had trusted Dad to handle Grandpa's final wishes with integrity. He said he'd be calling Dad personally, and from his tone, I didn't envy my father that conversation. On January 10th, my attorney called. Dad's lawyer had reached out requesting an extension, claiming Dad needed more time to liquidate assets. I told her no extensions. The deadline stood. She said Dad's attorney had hinted they might argue undue influence, that Grandpa hadn't been of sound mind when setting up the portfolios. I told her that was garbage. Grandpa had been sharp as a tack until the day he died, and the portfolio had been established 40 years ago anyway. Plus, we had the financial advisor's testimony confirming Grandpa's explicit instructions. She agreed and said she'd communicate our position. On January 15th, the first transfer hit my account. $280,000, exactly as calculated. My sister received hers the same day. My brother got his on January 17th. Dad had sold the vacation house at a loss, the new car, and had taken out a massive loan against the family home. Mom confirmed this when she called me, said Dad was panicking about how to cover the loan payments with his failing business. She also said she'd filed for divorce on January 12th. She was asking for her fair share of what remained, which wasn't much, but she was also making sure she wasn't liable for Dad's debts going forward. My brother called me last week and said Dad had shown up at his office, looking haggard and desperate. Dad asked if he could borrow money to help cover expenses now that everything had collapsed. My brother told him no, reminded him that every dollar in his account was money Dad had already stolen once. Dad apparently broke down crying, said he'd made mistakes, but that we were still family. My brother said he'd told Dad that family didn't steal from each other, didn't play favorites, didn't spend decades making one son feel worthless while propping up another with stolen funds. Dad left without another word. My sister used part of her inheritance to properly restructure her boutique. She'd been operating under crushing guilt, thinking she owed Dad for his generosity, which had paralyzed her decision-making. Now, knowing it was her own money, she's brought in a real business consultant and is actually turning things around. My brother paid off his debts and invested the rest. He also broke up with his girlfriend, the one he'd bought the expensive ring for with Dad's help. Turned out she'd been more interested in the lifestyle Dad's money suggested than in my brother himself. As for me, I put most of the money into retirement accounts and college funds for the kids my wife and I are planning to have. A portion went to paying off our mortgage. For the first time in my adult life, I'm not living paycheck to paycheck, not grinding myself down to prove I'm worth something. The irony isn't lost on me that Grandpa's gift was meant to give us all a head start in life. And that's exactly what it's doing now, just years late and after nearly destroying our family in the process. Mom called yesterday. She's moved into an apartment and is job hunting. At 62, she's starting over. But she said she felt lighter than she had in years, said she'd been carrying the weight of Dad's deceptions without even knowing it. She asked if I'd have lunch with her sometime. I said yes. As for Dad, I haven't heard from him directly. Through the family grapevine, I've learned he's trying to keep his business afloat, struggling with the loan payments, and facing the reality that his reputation is shattered. The country club crowd he loved so much has distanced themselves. News travels fast in those circles. Part of me feels bad for him. He's my father, and despite everything, there were good moments growing up, Times when I thought maybe he did love me, just didn't know how to show it equally. But then I remember Christmas Eve, that smug look on his face when he said gifts were for the worthy ones only. I remember every graduation he missed, every achievement he dismissed, every time he made me feel like I wasn't good enough while showering my siblings with praise and money that wasn't even his to give. And I remember that he had a choice at every step. When Grandpa died, he could have distributed the inheritance as specified. When money got tight, he could have cut back his lifestyle, asked for help, been honest. When Christmas came around, he could have treated all his children equally or at least not been deliberately cruel. He made his choices. Now he's living with the consequences. Someone on my original post asked if it was worth destroying my family over money. But here's the thing, I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped letting the destruction be one-sided. For 32 years, Dad had been slowly poisoning our family with favoritism, lies, and theft. I just finally turned on the lights so everyone could see it. The family isn't destroyed. It's different now, reshaped, but maybe more honest than it's ever been. My sister and I talk regularly now. My brother and I are rebuilding a relationship that had always been strained by Dad's manipulation. Mom is discovering who she is outside of being Dad's wife. We're planning a gathering for Easter, just as kids and Mom. No performances, no proving our worth, no wondering whose turn it is to be the favorite. Just family, the real kind, built on honesty instead of hierarchy. And that's worth more than any inheritance. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.